Hello, anatomy friends. This is Dr. Alsip, and in this video, we will be discussing the ventricular system. So, after working through these concepts together, you should be able to diagram the ventricular system, so with the order it goes in. And you should be able to do this yourself. So, we're going to build those skills, and then we will describe the location and generalized flow of cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF. So ventricles tend to be one of the concepts that is always on the harder side for students to conceptualize. They're hard to see in the lab. When you're looking at illustrations like the one I have in this lecture, it makes them look like there are these solid structures. But what this blue is really trying to show you is the shape of the space. And that is the key word, space. Ventricles are spaces located within the brain. Now, it's not only the ventricles, but connecting channels as well that are going to be lined with ependymal or supporting and regulating cells. And these ventricles are actually derived from the central lumen or space of the embryonic neural tube. So in the walls of the ventricles, the cerebral spinal fluid, very commonly abbreviated to CSF, is produced and will make its way to the subarachnoid space, which will surround the entirety of the central nervous system, so brain and spinal cord. So let's talk in more detail about these ventricles. There are 4 ventricles that are connected. The most superiorly located, as well as the largest, are the paired lateral ventricles. And these could be called the first and the second ventricles, but they never are. Don't go around saying first and second ventricles. You'll always hear them referred to as the right and the left lateral ventricles. These are in the cerebral hemispheres, so they're spaces right within the cerebrum, and they have a distinct C shape. So you have anterior, as well as posterior and inferior horns associated with the lateral ventricles. Both lateral ventricles drain CSF via interventricular foramina. So there are 2 foramina for those 2 lateral ventricles. And so it will drain the lateral ventricles into the third ventricle. All right, so the third ventricle is often the most difficult to conceptualize because it's located in the midline of the diencephalon. So it is the space and portions of the thalamus and the hypothalamus. And we often look at these illustrations of the hemisected or section brain, and this is actually what we'll see a lot of in the lab as well. And we point to the diencephalon and we say, here is the third ventricle. But you have to think of bringing the other half of the brain back. And when you put them back together, there's going to be a space there between those 2 parts of the diencephalon. So it's pretty nicely visualized in this illustration here to the left. The third ventricle is connected to the fourth ventricle by the cerebral aqueduct, which is located within the midbrain region of the brainstem. And lastly, the fourth ventricle is located between the brainstem, the pons and the medulla specifically, and the cerebellum. And usually this ventricle is actually the easiest to observe of the 4 in a hemisected brain. Now, from the fourth ventricle, the majority of the CSF moves into the subarachnoid space via apertures in the ventricular wall, although a small amount will actually continue into the central canal of the spinal cord. So it's actually within the spinal cord. The central canal is a vestigial remnant of the ventricular system of the spinal cord. But again, the majority of CSF really is going into that subarachnoid space. The 3 main apertures that allow CSF to move into the subarachnoid space are the median, as well as the 2 lateral apertures. And all 3 of these will lead into something referred to as subarachnoid cisterns. So what are those? Well, they are subarachnoid space, but recall that the pia mater is always really closely adhered to the brain surface. And that arachnoid in the cistern regions is going to be more tinted over and further away from the pia mater, making a naturally occurring larger subarachnoid space, or a cistern, basically. So again, very much part of the subarachnoid space. It's continuous with the more generalized subarachnoid space, and that subarachnoid space in general will surround the entirety of the central nervous system, including the spinal cord, so not just the brain. Now let's talk a little about how CSF is formed. There are these highly vascularized structures attached to the walls of the ventricles. You'll have this in the lateral, the third, as well as the fourth. And these are referred to as choroid plexuses. They are represented in this kind of reddish color in the illustration to the right. And it's from the choroid plexuses that the CSF is secreted. And the flow of CSF is from superior to inferior to make its way to the subarachnoid space. And it's continually being produced and replaced, meaning that older CSF needs to be removed from the subarachnoid space, or we refer to this often as reabsorbed. And that will be reabsorbed into the venous system. And this is possible through regions referred to as arachnoid granulations, which are extensions of the arachnoid and the subarachnoid space that project into a dural venous sinus and allow for CSF to drain into or be reabsorbed by the venous sinus. And arachnoid granulations are associated with a few dural venous sinuses, but are most frequently and easily observable associated with the superior sagittal sinus that's located in the superior portion of the falx cerebri. Now, in certain pathological conditions, there can be abnormal accumulation of CSF, and that can lead to enlargement of portions of the ventricular system, or sometimes the entirety of the ventricular system. Blockages or obstructions are most common in those narrow channels or the foramina or apertures, and a blockage would most greatly affect the size of the more proximal ventricles to where that blockage occurs. So, say there is a blockage in the intervertebral foramina, this would most greatly affect the lateral ventricles and much less so in terms of the third and the fourth. Whereas if you had a blockage in the cerebral aqueduct, that would most greatly affect the lateral ventricles as well as the third ventricle, because that cerebral aqueduct is distal to the third ventricle. And if you had a blockage to any of the apertures associated with the fourth ventricle, that could affect or increase the size of the entire ventricular system, which you see in this image here on the right. Hydrocephalus may also be caused by ineffective absorption of CSF, but the more common cause that's often discussed is due to obstruction. All right, excellent. Thank you so much for your time and attention here. And as always, please reach out if you have any questions.